Hi, welcome to the Heart of the Soul podcast. I'm here today with Tammy. I have known her for about 6 years. She has been a midwife, a friend, a mentor, a supportive person in my life. I'm so grateful that she's been here with me along this path and is now my neighbor, even. She's going to talk today about her career as a midwife, her path into motherhood, as well as some other wonderful things. She has much wisdom to share. Would you mind telling us a little bit about you and where you're at in your life right now? And yeah, we'll start there.
Well, I am just finishing up my 60th season, or not season, 60th year, which is a end of a season. And I, like Amana said, I live 4 doors down and consider it a real blessing to have Amana as a neighbor. We have a great neighborhood. Um, I'm a mom of four, and they're all in their 30s, and one is almost 40, so that seems quite amazing. And I have 15 grandkids, and they range from almost 2 to 16.
Wonderful. Would you share a little bit about your journey into motherhood? Did you always know you wanted to be a mom? What was that like for you?
I babysat a lot growing up, and I liked little kids, and I thought I always would want to have some. But I planned no sooner than I was 25. I didn't want to have kids before then. I wanted to finish school and start my career. My mom hadn't really seemed like she wanted to have kids. She talked a lot about how I was the oldest, interrupted her college career. And in those days, and I was born in 1960, there weren't a whole lot of options. So my mom stayed home until we were older, and then she went back to school, finished school, and started working. So her input was always that I should be this career person, and I had really I agreed with that. And yet part of me really tugged toward, my heart was tugged towards children. And then when I got married when I was 19, so really young, and I felt ready to have kids pretty soon. And so I had my first baby when I was 21. Prior to that, I had had very little experience around birth. The only person I had seen pregnant and who had a baby where I went to the hospital um, and kind of had some visual of the experience was my aunt, and that was a real turn off to me. It was she was drugged up when I saw her on the gurney going into the delivery room, and she talked nonsense. And when she was pregnant, she would just like flip her shirt up and show her belly with stretch marks, and there was nothing uplifting about it. It was always kind of a negative, like being pregnant was
Mm-hmm.
kind of ugly. Having a baby, by my estimation, looked pretty horrid. And so, even though, so I think that's part of why I said I didn't want to have any babies before I was 25, is like, I need some time to be able to cope with that. But when I can't remember if I was pregnant or right before I got pregnant with my oldest, I met a woman who had had a baby with a midwife in Spokane, and she had had one home birth and had had her fourth baby in the hospital just for money reasons. Like in those days, if you did it within like 4 hours, you went in, had your baby, and left, you could do it for like $400. So it was was way cheaper. So I never was with her or around her when she had her baby at home, but she told me about it, and it was really intriguing. And so I sought that out when I first was pregnant with my oldest. At that point, I had never heard of midwives. Um, I'd never had any curiosity about I just had never been exposed. I was truly a blank slate in that regard.
Mm-hmm.
But my midwife was one of a couple here in Spokane that a doctor had. Women were starting to have home births without being attended, and attended meaning anybody who the doctor considered as um, qualified. So he got this nurse midwife that worked with his office to do out of hospital births, and then she and another midwife opened a birth center on the South Hill, and that's where I met up with her, and she was a nun. And so we were her family, and it was very nurturing for me at the time. I think today I probably would have chosen a different midwife, um, just because as I look back on it and re-met her years later, she was not as nurturing, like wanting to hug and that, as I had become. And so anyway, she was super great person, very much a mentor as I proceeded to become a La Leche League leader. And then as I pursued midwifery, she would contact me periodically and just tell me how proud she was of me. And she was very motherly towards me in ways that my mom hadn't been, because, in my family, what I was doing was really suspect at best.
Yeah. What was the story that you heard from your mom about your own birth? Did she
Yeah,
share with
yeah. So
you?
she played chess while she was in labor, and she didn't go in until late. So, kudos to her. She went in the evening and had me at just about 11. And in those days, they knocked most everybody
Oh.
out. So she was anesthetized, and I was born. I kind of sometimes wonder if maybe I was forceps delivery, just sometimes looking at bones in my head. And she didn't know any particulars about it. But in those days, you were put in the hospital nursery.
Mm-hmm.
And she breastfed me for a month. I was the only one in our family she did, just because she was poor. But she didn't know, her doctor didn't encourage it. She didn't know anybody who did. And so when she just still kept leaking milk at a month, she had stopped. Though she had regrets about that. When I had my kids, she expressed, "Oh, I could have kept going, and that would have been nice." So at 1 week, you'd be in the hospital. Then she took us home, and she said it took her a week of having us home before, as I had a couple siblings, before she felt like we were hers. So, and you were brought from the nursery to see her just for feedings. And they
Mm-hmm.
said I was a very beautiful and good baby, which kind of, I always just kind of stuff it, so I probably wasn't a screamer. I just
Mm-hmm.
was like, oh, I'm alone. I'll just be quiet and wish someone was here. Um, so that has kind of also followed me through my life. And anyway, she took me home, and uh, did her very best.
Yes. So leading into your first birth, can you share with us a little bit more about what that was like, how labor started, how that
Yeah,
experience was for you, having not like witnessed many, births, or I don't know how much you knew about the process at that time. And
the birth center was pretty good at educating, but in those days it was like a film. So you'd go to your birth class and they'd show a few films, and that was useful. My midwife had a lot of books, and I like to read, so I would just spend a lot of time reading about. Well, that's where I learned about nutrition, and so she didn't talk a lot about birth, but I was able to read about it. There was no internet in those
mm-hmm,
days. It was really books was kind of it, or word of mouth, and there wasn't a
mm-hmm,
lot of word of mouth about it. So I had varicose veins, and so spent a fair amount of time at the end of pregnancy with my legs elevated in a lazy boy recliner. Well, so everybody who understands posterior labors could see how that would have been my experience. But my midwife didn't talk about that. So I had started to have regular contractions on a Friday, and we lived in Ritzville, and we came to Spokane, and stayed at my parents' thinking, of course, birth was going to be imminent. And 4 days later, I finally did have her, but I had continual contractions from that Friday night till Tuesday afternoon when I had her.
Wow.
But I never dilated past 3 until Tuesday. So I would go in once or twice a day to the birth center. They'd check me and they'd say, yeah, no. But in those days, there wasn't a lot of discussion about positioning. Nobody said go for a walk, crawl on your hands and knees, all of the things that I might suggest to someone today. So I was really just in the dark as to what was going on. My body felt like it was not cooperating, and I didn't understand why. And clearly the people around me were worried. So I felt that too, though the midwives weren't worried. They just didn't give me any real information. So on Tuesday morning, when I went in and went to the midwives, they said, you're still 3. I've been having all these contractions. I hadn't slept. I had been timing them for days, and it was just kind of a mess at that point. I went home and my dad met me outside and he was like, how are you? And I just was like, I'm never going to have this baby. And I just started crying, and he just walked away. He had nothing to offer. So I went in, they gave me a tranquilizer because they had said you should have something to drink, some alcohol, smooth muscle relaxer, you'll go to sleep. And my parents didn't drink, so I didn't have access to any alcohol. So they gave me this tranquilizer. I went to sleep, and so that would have been like 10. I woke up at noon, my water broke, and then I had her at 4. So it was really fast once I relaxed enough and she rotated, and I got up. Actually, I woke up screaming. So I'm sure everyone thought I was dying, but my mom's had gotten a new mattress for the bed, and I was screaming because, oh my God, I have just leaked all of this fluid all over your new mattress. Sorry. So I took a shower, and the contractions got harder, and we went in and pushed not that long, maybe a half hour, I think. And I had a 9-pound, 1-ounce baby girl.
Amazing.
Yeah. Do you remember Clairol makeup mirrors? They're like square with lights around them. That was the mirror they set up for you to watch the baby be born. Yeah.
Yeah. And did you enjoy watching? Did you watch? I know sometimes there are mirrors and you don't want to look. So
I did not. No, the pushing for me was super intense, which is, I look back at my chart, is probably because the pushing second stage went really fast. And there was nobody to say, hey, look in my eyes, be present. I didn't, and I was used to dissociation as a good coping tool. So I just used that, and I was pretty checked out because that was just my way of coping with things.
Yeah.
But I liked her a lot when she came out.
Yeah. What was postpartum like for you and that connection? And
it was great. She went up on my chest. I knew no one. I knew some people at church who nursed their babies, but there was no one with good breastfeeding information, really. There was barely La Leche League. And I had gone to a La Leche League meeting before I had her. But anyway, I really knew nothing. But she just was up on my chest, and I was 21, and nature took its course. She latched on. Nursing was great. So I had no trouble ever.
Did you have community support during your postpartum? Did people help feed you, or what was that like, that time period for you?
My mom came. We went back. Well, I went to my sister-in-law's for like 4 days, I think was what the midwife required, so she could come and see me she wouldn't drive to where we lived. So that was a little weird because I was in somebody else's house. So I ate fine, but it just was awkward. You know, you were waking people up if the baby cried. And in those days, nobody ever talked about sleeping with your baby. You know, it was always assumed there was a crib and I put the baby in the crib, but that didn't really work because she'd cry. And so there was that confusion. But once I got home and my mom came and fixed food and sewed her a new dress, and it was just nice having my mom there. But my mom didn't have a whole lot of information either. She was good emotional, physical support in that her presence was comforting, but I didn't really have anybody the internet would have been useful for me. Because there were just so many unknowns. But when you're 21, you're used, and you've been in college, you're kind of used to just sitting around. So I was good at just sitting around holding my baby. My mother-in-law later was like, something about our garden, and I said, I can't go out there and work in the garden, and the baby cries. And she goes, well, put her in the playpen. I used to put my kids in the playpen and they'd just be fine while I worked in the garden. I go, she cries if I put her in the playpen. And she's like, well, just leave her there. And I'm like, no, I'm not going to leave my baby in the playpen crying. So there was definitely a clash of parenting styles.
Yes.
Because attachment parenting was kind of coming up as a possibility, but Dr. Spock and, being rigid with your kids was still the norm.
Yeah. And how did that, you have 3 more children, and how did that journey come along? Did you always know you wanted multiple children, or?
Well, I'd only wanted 2, but I liked my first one so much that I was pretty ready to have another one. And every time we would get to 1 year, when the baby was 1 year, we'd say, oh, it'd be kind of nice to have another one. And then we'd have another baby. We did that 2 more times. And then the 4th baby, my body just said, hey, the baby's 1 year. It's time to get pregnant. Because we weren't really wanting to have another baby at that point. So
yes,
that was, I would just get pregnant when the baby was 1 year. So they're all 22, 23 months apart. And it was good. The second time was faster, and I barely made it to the birth center.
Yeah. Did you choose the same care provider for?
Yeah. Well, for the 3, and then we had moved to the Midwest, and the state we were in, Illinois, home birth, out of hospital birth was illegal. And, or was it illegal? I think it was illegal. Like, you would get in trouble only if something bad happened. But there were no legal midwives doing out of hospital births. So we were in a cultish church, and we just trained ourselves to be our midwives, and because people still were doing that kind of stuff, and because we couldn't find anybody, and we did our own births. So that's how I had my 4th baby.
Is there anything particular you'd like to share from your other 3 births?
Well, it was really lovely to see how, once I'd had that really long prodromal labor, that I could recognize that I wasn't going to necessarily have the second baby, the minute I had started to have contractions. So I just hung out at home. I ate, I fed the baby. I watched a Magnum PI at 8. And at that point I was like, to my partner, you need to get your mom here, because these contractions are getting harder. So she came, and then we drove to Spokane, which was about an hour. And I put my hand on my partner's leg, and I said, I'll just squeeze when I have a contraction. And then I just started squeezing more and more often, and he started driving more and more fast. And in those days, there were no cell phones, so we had to pull off the freeway when we got to Spokane. He had to go into a phone booth, call their on-call person, and then we sat in the parking lot of the birth center with me having contractions until somebody finally showed up. And that was like at 11. And then I had him just after midnight. And that was a really, I had some back labor. That was the first and only time that I really had anybody with me who provided any doula type care. And she put some pressure on my back, I think, or my legs. I don't remember. But she did some things that helped the baby to rotate and gave me some physical comfort, which was really nice. Then he came out and he was a little bit stuck, not bad, but just, I remember looking down at the midwife and her saying very clearly, very calmly, "You need to push the baby out now." And I was like, oh, okay. But part of that came from, it was midnight and all the lights were off. And so people called each other, and I ended up with my mom, my aunt, a friend from high school, and my sister-in-law in the room with me, not invited. And I could tell my mom was worried. And so my body was pushing the baby out, but I was really focused on my mom, that she was worried.
Her worry. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so that's why the midwife needed to remind me that actually I was having a baby and it was going to require a little bit of extra help from me. And he ended up having either a broken or bruised collarbone. We later found when we went to a chiropractor who was working on his dad, and he said, yeah, he's out. And so did a little bit of baby adjustment, and he had started to get a cold right away, and that went away. So that was a little more exciting. My third baby, I did not invite my mom, which hurt her feelings, but I just I couldn't be a mom to my baby and a mom to my mom. So I chose to not have her come, or anyone else. And that one was pretty straightforward. At this point, I think someone told me, the nurse who worked there said, the midwife had told her I always have long prodromal labors, and then once I get to active labor, I have the baby fast. I was like, well, that would have been nice to know. I did not know that about myself. So now I knew by the fourth time. And so when the fourth time came around, I had more varicose veins, spent more time with my legs elevated. So I had that really long prodromal labor again. Started on a Friday morning. I didn't have her till early Monday morning. But I didn't miss a meal. I didn't miss sleep. I didn't miss church. I didn't miss anything because I just ignored it until it was really going. And then she came out pretty easy because all the other kids were 9 pounds and she was 7. And so I always say she just sneezed out.
And this one you're talking about, your fourth?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. And how was that different for you, not having a midwife present and having other women with you?
It was good. It was the first time that I did have one vaginal exam right when I started to push, because we were still under the impression you needed to know if you were 10 centimeters dilated or not. And so somebody checked me. We called ourselves midwives. Yeah. So I did feel like I had care, but the really great thing about it was I didn't do anything I didn't want to do. So like I didn't have routine cervical checks at the end of pregnancy. Everything was just really straightforward. We did I wrote down what my clinical assessments were, how much I weighed, what did I measure, what was the baby's heart rate. It was just lovely. She came out nicely and we went and got in bed and went to sleep.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like you were providing care for each other in sort of the ways that probably our ancestors did many years ago, before like the formalization of midwifery care.
Yeah, I didn't go to appointments.
Yeah.
People came by my house. And that was nice. That was really nice, which definitely all of my experiences affected the kind of care I wanted to provide other women. I wanted to give women an opportunity to direct their care.
Yes.
And in many ways be more of a facilitator. Clearly, I'm the one with who's had the education and has the information, but women, it's their bodies, it's their babies, and I want them to feel empowered and in charge of their experience because it meant so much to me to do that.
Yes.
And I think people who have trauma in their lives in their past, so I don't really know what went on for me, but I know that I had trauma as a little kid. And women who have trauma are often inclined to choose women care for themselves and to choose midwives. So it made sense, even what I know psychologically now, why women choose who they choose for care providers, why, even though I'd never heard of a midwife, it appealed to me, and why I chose that, even though it was dramatically different than the culture that I was in.
Yes, I mean, still, it's about 1% of women give birth at home.
Yeah, it used to be, they'd say 1%, but it was under 1%. And now it's a little over 1%, but it's still rounding. It's still considered 1%.
Yes. And they still talk about, like, even within that 1 or 1 point whatever percent, that a quarter of those births are unplanned to be at home. So yeah, that's kind of amazing. I wonder if you would mind sharing a little bit about your path to midwifery and when you decided that that was something that you wanted to pursue.
So in 1985, I think I was a doula before there were doulas to my sister-in-law when she was having her baby at the same place that I had my baby. And that was really nice. I could tell that it helped her. And so I enjoyed that. And I believe at the time someone from the birth center, because they already knew me because I'd had my kids there, commented on that I had done a good job. Had I considered midwifery, or, something to the effect of, you seem good at this. Maybe you should consider doing it. And I really wanted to support, I really was into the babies at that point because I had babies. Then as time went on, so I was one of the group doing the midwifery care in the church we were in. And so I definitely had an interest. We trained, we read, we practiced stuff. We had our sterilized kits that we had. We did all of the things that you would do to be considered, to consider yourself providing optimal care to people, other than we were training each other. And so we lacked certain skill sets that I decided I needed before I would actually ever call myself a midwife beyond that. So I just kind of was dabbling in supporting women around birth, and it appealed to me. I did not ever have support of my partner in that job. So it would have been in the late 80s, I started to get Seattle Midwifery School, their brochure every year, their curriculum. And in those days, again, there was still no internet, or not much. So they had to send it to me, and it was a little booklet. And I would get one every year, and I would think, oh, I want to do this. But I would have had to relocate for a couple years. My partner was not open to doing that. And I checked, with friends of his that I loved and had a good relationship with, and they also said they wouldn't do that for their partner either. So I was clearly in bad group of people as far as getting support as a woman to pursue a career. So eventually, I started working as a doula, and I went and took the Penny Simkin course over at Seattle Midwifery School, and became a PALS, which was a Pacific Association of Labor Support member. I was the only one because I think I was only doula in Spokane at that time. I became a La Leche League leader. So I was doing all of these things that I could locally to support my desire to be with women. And eventually, a Seattle Midwifery School came up with their program that was 1 week on site, and the rest of the time you worked at a distance with your just online. And that's how I got my midwifery training. What was your question? I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, you've answered it. I asked how sort of your journey into midwifery began, and I'd love to hear about your career as a midwife and how you've sort of evolved and over time, what your philosophy of care is.
Yeah, so in the 90s, I worked as a birth doula and as a midwifery assistant with a number of mentors. And then I started midwifery school. I started midwifery school, the very first day was 9/11. And yeah, so that was a big deal. And then I did 2 years in one, I did all the didactic part of the training in 1 year. And I chose, because I already had a lot of clinical experience with my mentors, and I had doula clients that were wanting to hire me as their midwife, with my mentor as the person who was with me at appointments and with me at the birth. I didn't really want to pay the school for the clinical experience that I already was doing and had set up. So there is an, I don't know if that's still available. I think it is. There was a track through Washington State licensing that as long as you had all of this didactic training and you could prove the clinical training as well, practicum, then you could get licensed without having a degree, a certification through approved midwifery school, which at the time was Seattle Midwifery School. There was like only one approved school.
Yeah.
So that's the route that I took to get my midwifery license. And I had that and my CPM in 2003. I went to St. Lucia and worked there 2002 or 3, I don't remember which year. I went there and worked for a few weeks and did like 24 births to get all the numbers that you need for Washington State. But all of the, other than those births, all the other births that I had, I think we needed 50. Those all were births where I spent all the prenatal time, long, hour-long prenatal visits, at least, however long they needed with labor and their births. And then at the same time, or their postpartum, and at the same time, I was going to hospital births with people as their doula. So that was really good for me because I'd always had my babies at home. I didn't have any experience with hospital birth really until I started working as birth doula. And my philosophy. So my philosophy around birth is about education, that it's works best when people know what's happening. It's what I've wanted for myself. I feel like it's fine with me if somebody wants to change. I've always said you should change care if you have a provider that you're not clicking with or don't feel good about at some point in labor, all the way up until you have the baby. So I feel that that's really important, that women know that they don't have to stay where they are or with who they're initially connected or committed to, having that midwife client relationship with. And just that birth, that pregnancy, birth, and the postpartum would be an empowering time. Women have been unempowered around birth since 1950s. Most women had their babies in the hospital, and with that, most people had, at least until the mid 60s, were knocked out. So they didn't even experience what birth was. And then about that point, they started to really discourage breastfeeding too. And so there was just, I believe I think we see the repercussions of a disconnected culture. And the initial connection comes with moms with babies. Not that can't be worked on once the birth has happened, but it's harder. There's all the hormones in place for everything to happen, connection to happen, when we don't have a whole bunch of drugs involved. Unfortunately, with many moms of my mom's era, they didn't feel really connected to their kids. And my mom was a daughter of an adopted mom, so her mom didn't feel connected. Her mom was knocked out, didn't breastfeed, so she had all of these ways to be detached. And then my mom was also, and I feel like with myself and now my children, there is a opportunity to kind of have do-overs, and create connection where disconnection has grown. And I think we see it across the board in our culture of just so much separation from one another, why we have such a huge need for elder care, out of home elder care.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it sounds like through your life and experiences and choices, you are, healing some of that, doing some of that ancestral healing in your relationships with your children and grandchildren.
Before my mom died, one of the things that just really has always stood out to me is she stood in a doorway and she looked at me, and the sun was behind her. And she just said, "I want you to know, Tammy, you've taught me love." And it was like, I always knew that she loved me, but she was able to watch this progression of me grow babies, have babies, nurse babies, and see the connection that she lacked and probably, and wanted. We all want connection. So now there's the whole part of psychology, segment of psychology, offshoot of psychology. I guess it's not really an offshoot, but the pre and perinatal psychology. That information is just growing and growing. And I put a plug in here for Association of Pre and Perinatal Psychology and Health. It's APA, and it's APPPAH, and they have resources that are free that you can look at, as well as you can join and have more access to their information. And they talk about so much about how a woman feels when she's pregnant and her relationships with people, how that affects the growing baby. And even in the newborn time, when the baby doesn't have recall, it's still affecting the baby. And I know that in my lifetime, like when my mom was a teacher, and they were still being or thinking that it was nature over nurture, that you were a blank slate when you were born, and then whatever was put into you is who you were going to be. And we know that's not the case now.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I'll be sure to include in the show notes that website that you just spoke about.
Okay, great.
And at what point I know you also had a natural grocery store for 25 years. When, I don't actually know the details of when in your life that came to be.
Yeah, so I've always been an entrepreneur, even when I was a little kid. Like I had cooking classes. I was always looking for a way to make a buck and always had lots of ideas. So when my kids were little, even before some of them were born, there were food buying clubs and we lived in the country, and we would get together as groups of women and we would go through a catalog of, which in those days was like Mountain Peoples, which became UNFI, which would be more like an Azure catalog that's currently around in this area. And so we would sit and we would go like, I want 10 pounds of whole wheat flour, and somebody else would go, well, I'll take 5 pounds, and we had to get rid of 50 pounds. And so we would just go through and split stuff up so we could buy in bulk. And then we would we'd place the order, we'd give our money, and then it would get delivered to somebody's house and it would get split up and people would come by and pick it up. And when I came back to that so we had joined this church, moved around a bunch, and then we came back to our farm. And at that point, everybody had gone to work, all the women had, and there were no more food buying clubs. And I still wanted that food to feed my kids. So I just figured out a way how to be the food buying club, and with a little bit of a markup. And we sold raw milk. So I would just get this in every couple weeks. Computers started to come out, so I had a dot matrix printer, and I would print off my inventory, and then I would deliver it to people and deliver the food to people. So Lydia, my youngest, was 2, and we started to get these orders in, and this giant truck would show up in our farmyard and unload stuff for us. And super cool. They were really like the driver, this one driver we had, Oli, for years. He made our youngest his beneficiary on his life insurance because he didn't have kids, and he took us to concerts. Like, we had these relationships that were super sweet from that experience of doing this crazy stuff out of our house. And then I noticed when people would come out to the farm to pick up some stuff, they would see what inventory I had on hand, because I didn't always sell out a whole case of something. And so they buy more. And I thought, oh my God, if we had a storefront, they could see what there was. And then I was like, okay, I could do that. And then if there was a deli, they would eat the food and they would go, it's so good. So then they would have to buy the stuff to make it out of the store. So we had this tiny little store with a deli in it. So started in 1989. And after a couple years at home, we moved into a little storefront, and then we moved to a bigger storefront by the freeway. And then people would come to that store and go, why aren't you in Spokane? We wish you would be in Spokane. We made cookies and pizza and burgers, and people would stop in to buy cookies on their way on a trip, and they'd be really disappointed if we didn't have the cookies they wanted, and they'd be like, be in Spokane. So then we started looking for a place in Spokane, which is what the building we ended up buying on 5th and Thor. And we had 2 locations for a little while, and then that was just clearly the Spokane store was going to do way better than the Ritzville store. And so we closed the Ritzville one and just had the Spokane store. That happened sometime in the 90s.
Wow. Yes.
Yeah. So
you've had so many creations in your life. It's so beautiful.
Well, then I used it to move to the beach because my mother died of brain cancer, and I was just super busy with midwifery practice, and I felt very overwhelmed. And so really, retail stores shouldn't be like that fluid. So, we picked it up and we moved it over there, made it smaller and all that. But with the downturn in the economy, it was just, it got by, which is all it really was supposed to do. But a whole bunch of other things happened, and it was just after 8 years time to move back to Spokane. So we moved back, and now the store building is a bar and restaurant. So that works.
Yes. We have so many transitions in life, and it's kind of amazing how they just keep on coming. And I find myself like thinking I made one transition and into this role that I anticipate sometimes is going to last longer than it does. And then life shifts again.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And it's good. It's good to be willing to change.
Yes. I know that you've spoken a little bit about during your time supporting women through
Mm-hmm.
pregnancy and motherhood and being that strong, supportive person alongside them, and that you've had the opportunity to witness what that transition is for many women and how sometimes it's a portal into like a greater life change.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if you could share a little bit about that.
Yes, I think that is so huge. I don't know what most women's experience is, but I definitely didn't really enjoy the girl to girl relationships for the most part through high school. And so when I started to work with women having babies, particularly focusing on the babies. I think I said that earlier. And
Mm-hmm.
then I reached a point where I was in love with the women that I was working with. The babies are great. I love babies, but the women are what my purpose is for. And I mean, even today, as I will sit and work on, what is my purpose? Here I am. I'm finishing my 60th year. What is this next season bringing? What is my purpose? And it is always the women. The women are who I want to support, whether it's if I'm choosing to help with a nonprofit, it's always, the babies and the families benefit from where the women are, but the women are my focus. The women will take care of their babies and their families. I don't feel that as my mission or purpose. And try to think where I went from there. So at that point, I realized that women who I hadn't liked that much earlier on in my life, when they have a baby, they open up. And they open up in a way that oftentimes they've never opened before. And at that point, I have an opportunity to be in their lives. And then a lot of times after they have the baby, they close back up again. They're not ready to stay open in that space. But I'm still in there. And that gives me an opportunity to still be available to them, to support them, kind of forever, you know. I have friends. So I started with midwifery where the women I worked with were more my peers. And then I became more the age of their sister, maybe their mother. And now I'm a grandma. And it's been really interesting to I have friends of all ages for that reason, that I got to be in that space and be in people, be in their hearts, them in my heart. And we care about one another. So it's been really interesting as the peer group who I helped have babies have been coming into their 50s and are starting, or 60s, and starting to enjoy this last season of life. And so I get to be supportive of people from menses through menopause. And that is a very lovely thing, very, very much an honor to be in women's life in that way. So I feel like I missed the end of your question. What was your question?
Okay. I don't exactly remember at this point.
Like, I went off.
But you had me thinking about, you've imparted so much wisdom to me during our journey of like being your client and being a friend. And I have just felt so nourished and guided and empowered, by you, helping me to like recognize the power that I do have of myself, and also recognizing, learning to place boundaries and to just be more into my own person. in some ways, like separating from like my parents. Like my parents weren't comfortable with home birth either, and like things like that, but embracing it and you acknowledging that it's, you know, if it feels like the right path to me, then it is a right and good path, if that makes sense. And yeah, you have me wondering, as you've transitioned into this crone menopause era of your life, if you have any reflections at this point in your life from your different journeys through these different stages.
Can we take a pause here?
Mm-hmm.
So as far as transitioning in going through menopause was a really interesting experience for me. And I guess I first off want to just say that I'm sad. I've been sad a lot about women's issues over the years, because it's like we called having our periods the curse. And when I started having my period, I didn't want to pay attention to it. I wanted to pretend like it didn't happen. And that changed once I had kids, and I wanted to see my blood, and I wanted to know what was going on, and I wanted my kids to not feel weird about it. Like I couldn't talk with my mom about that. It wasn't considered anything you talked about. It was always hush hush, and just so uncomfortable about being a woman. There was nothing about it that was lauded as it should be.
Yeah, we haven't been celebrated.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it was just always a negative. And then having babies, same kind of thing. When I was having babies, there was, in my family anyway, so much negativity about being pregnant and the experience, and birth was icky, and there was just very little joy. Everybody was bottle fed. I was the first person to breastfeed in my extended family. I had cousins after me, cousin who did, but I was the oldest grandkid. And so for several generations, there'd been no real breastfeeding. And so then come around to menopause, and I have no idea when it's going to happen, because all of the women in my family, even my younger cousin, have all had hysterectomies. So I had no idea what timing to even expect. And I had a lot of stress when my mom was sick, and I was so busy with the store and midwifery and my own personal issues around my primary relationship. And I thought I was maybe going through early menopause, but then I went to acupuncture, and with some herbs from the acupuncturist and regular acupuncture and massage, my period returned to more normal timing. It wasn't weird bleeding. It just, was a normal, more 28 days, few days of bleeding, and that went on into my 50s. And in my early 50s, it came to a point where I had just stopped bleeding monthly. And so I got to 6 months, and I had a party, like, I'm halfway there. It was super awesome. People came, we had a good time. And then my period started the next month. And then it did that for a while. And then I did started to have another basically 6 months of no bleeding. And at that point I was like, okay, this is really it. And then I bled again. And I was like, who the hell cares at this point? It'll happen when it happens. So I actually have no idea when I went through menopause, because I wasn't paying any attention. I no longer charted it. I just ignored it. So somewhere in my 50s, I went through menopause, and I had a couple years, maybe at the most, where I had hot flashes, and I just wore a lot of tank tops and hoodies, and I just would strip down if I was hot and put the sweatshirt back on if I was cold. And I considered it an interesting experiment. Took herbs to help with any weird bleeding. Excuse me when I cough. And I had some times where I had more flooding kind of bleeding. And so I would drink a pregnancy tea. I would just drink a quart of it all at once, and that would always take care of it. And I took herbs on a regular basis just to support going through menopause, just herbs that are supportive to women. And yeah, it just was, I thought, super interesting and fascinating. Now, I believe a lot of, some people have really debilitating symptoms. I did not have that. But a lot of people just feel bad about it because we've been taught that's kind of the end of yourself as a woman. Like, you're going to be dry, your tissues are going to be thin. It's just like, you're just going to be an old dried up thing. And I did not find that to be the case. I actually found that I was more sensual and sexual and excited about life, having gone through that. Because for one thing, you can't get pregnant anymore. That's super exciting. And you don't have to worry about, do I have pads or tampons with me because my period might start. You still cycle, you still have feelings. Like, I can tell when when it would normally be my period time or my ovulation time, just about how I feel in my body. But it's not so intense. And it's just a super exciting period of time. So I'm sad when women, or when I hear the culture at large speak negatively about this time in women's life, or I read women write or hear women talk about, oh, that's going to happen, and they're not looking forward to it. And I want to spread the message that it's such a great opportunity to have a new season of life. You generally don't have little kids anymore, and you can do, you're just more free.
I love that you're bringing up the sort of reframe of this transition. And I feel like, yeah, in our culture right now, we do this to most of the women transitions. Like you said, when people first start bleeding, there's also, you called it the curse growing up. And I wonder if you, with your own girls, have sort of reframed it for them or honored it in a different and new way than you had it honored for yourself, that transition into bleeding.
I didn't do any particular party event honoring kind of thing, which I, in hindsight, would have liked to have done. I think that we don't have enough traditions around these changes, these transitions for women. I would like to be a part of that if my daughters decide to do that for their granddaughters. I think that would be a really lovely thing. And maybe, even as we're talking, maybe it's something that I can know when it happens, even if they don't do any celebration, but I could take them and do something special, have some sort of outing that's special, just for them to honor that this is a really lovely thing that has happened. I've talked to somebody whose daughter started their period, and I said, well, congratulations. And clearly the mother didn't think that it was congratulatory discussion. So I'm like, tell her congratulations. That's so awesome. And it was like, what's wrong with you? But I do feel that it is all of the transitions should be honored and be an exciting thing, because we're women. It's not the same all the time. And so I love change. And so to change to a new time of life where you can do different things than you've been doing, you can look at things differently. I think I love it. So.
Absolutely. That's really beautiful. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome.
Before we close, I would love to give you some space to talk about your offerings right now to the community. You're a midwife, you're a craniosacral practitioner, you have you have tea and vaginal steam herbs and more. And I wonder if you would like to share about that.
Sure. with COVID, there's been definitely less of that focus for me. Also, just a time of life for whatever reason, as this season is changing for me. I've really spent the last year and COVID has made it really possible to do, where I've just really focused on what do I want this next season to be. But I do still offer midwifery care. I always laugh when someone finds me because I don't advertise, and I just say, hey, well, if you find me, awesome. Then I'm happy to be your midwife. So yeah, I still do offer midwifery care. And my biggest focus is tea. And I've just about finished up some new logos, and just going to do a look at some different marketing than previously, and really kind of put my energy towards that.
Mm-hmm.
I think it embodies so much of what's important to me. It's supporting women, and the teas not only support women, but it supports their families. It also gives me the opportunity to do education with women, which is important to me. I make myself available with phone consults or emails or texts to talk about what different herbs do for you, why the tea blend has what it has. Yeah, so that's kind of my major focus right now. And so you should be seeing more of that promoted out there.
Wonderful. I know I have enjoyed your teas during pregnancy and postpartum and gifted them to friends, and also used your vaginal steam herbs. And I really find that to be a beautiful ritual and practice too. I love that you incorporated that into part of your midwifery care, that that the tea to drink was part of the care, as well as the vaginal steam herbs. And I thought that was really beautiful and unique.
And the pregnancy tea is something that we used to sell in our store, make and sell in our store. And so I think I have probably sold it for 25 years. It is so great for, I feel like it helps women, the herbs in it help women build their blood. So drinking it during pregnancy is great for anybody who would be prone towards anemia. But it also seems to just really help recuperation postpartum if a person has been drinking it. All those vitamins and minerals that are concentrated in the dried herbs. And drinking it through labor and postpartum. I've had people call me and say, who've had babies before, say, what's wrong with me? I'm not bleeding enough. And I'm like, no, actually, that's really a good thing. You don't have to use that energy to create more blood. If you don't bleed more, that's actually not a bad thing. So you can enjoy the benefits of drinking the tea for just blood building and recuperation, recovery postpartum. And it also has herbs that are good in supporting breastfeeding too. So even though I do a lactation tea, the pregnancy tea also has things that support breastfeeding. And then I found it so useful during menopause because I just feel like it helps, or anybody who has heavy bleeding with their period. If you drink a quart of it at once, I always had really great results to slow bleeding that I thought was heavier than I wanted for myself, and other people have reported the same. And I've even had somebody who started giving it to their teenage son, and they felt like hormonally their kid was being supported and nicer to be around.
Wow.
I know, that was really weird. But I've always had such good reports from people who've used the tea from the get-go, even before I was using it in my practice and just sold it in our store. People always gave really good reports about it. So I really haven't altered the combination much over the years, and it just continues to, it's nourishing. And, that's the bottom
Yes,
line.
it is. I love how it's like the sort of common thread too, because it's for, pregnancy and menstruation and menopause, and it has the nutrition component. And I think that's really beautiful. And I'm also remembering that I wanted to ask you about your experience with birth outside of the US and how maybe that compares, or how they were similar or different, how birth and is witnessed or care, how women are cared for through birth in America compared to other places you've been.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is. I went to St. Lucia in the early 2000s and worked there at a hospital. They don't do out of hospital birth generally. If there was, I'm sure somebody is, but there was no discussion of anybody doing that in the area. And there, women saw somebody for prenatal care, and it was usually a doctor. And then they would come to the hospital in labor, and the midwives provided their care, unless there was something serious that came up that needed a doc OB to come in. And that was really interesting because this was a country that had gotten US support like 30 years prior. And so they had done some infrastructure building buildings and things with this aid from the US, but then the aid dried up. And so they were kind of just like stopped at that point from really growing roads, and their buildings were literally stopped in construction. And so our hospital in the midwifery or the OB area was like 30-year-old hospital beds from the US. And there was this, so they were the plasticky vinyl stuff, and they had really thin sheets that would throw over it, but when you're in labor it would move around, and so you're pretty much having the baby on this vinyl stuff. And they had an ultra or a Doppler, was a fetal monitor, it wasn't a Doppler, and they would just, if they were going to listen to the baby, they would roll that big Hummer around to the different rooms. And we brought Dopplers as gifts to use, and they would just keep them locked up because they weren't used to using them. They were just used to this big honking fetal monitor that we would move around. So it was very interesting as far as the way they went about doing birth. We set up a little table beside the women giving birth, and we always stood in exactly the same place, and we did our hands exactly the same way. And it was really good for me to see, because I was like, oh, now I get doctors. Why? Because I'd been going as a doula to the hospital births, and honestly, having a bad attitude personally, like, oh, do they always have to do that? Like, why do they always set their tray up like that? And why won't they let the mom move around? Well, because it's easier. And when the mom is just staying in one spot and you are always standing in the exact same spot, your muscle memory is you just do the same thing over and over again. And so it gave me some compassion for people I hadn't had compassion necessarily for, the care providers, and what they were used to doing and why they chose to do it that way. The women had lovely labors and births in spite of conditions that I would consider not desirable. A vinyl hospital bed. And
Did they have their own rooms, or was it multiple women in a room?
there were a couple rooms that could have multiple people, but generally they were in their own room. They all got enemas, hot, high, and soapy, and I'd never done enemas before, so that was new for me. And then again, so why do my age group, we were like writing our birth plans and saying no enemas, no shaves. You guys haven't had to deal with that, but that was what was routinely done in the US. And so again, they're 30 years, they're doing what we did here 30 years ago, still there. And so they were doing these enemas. But what you found was a mom who'd had babies before, if she got a high, hot, soapy enema, she'd have that baby really quick after she had it, because what does it do? It moves all the stool out of the way and the baby drops down and is born. So I was like, oh, okay, I get that now. I still don't think people need to have that, but it is, I get the reason. And so it just gave me, in those years, I was still really pretty judgmental about things I thought were right and other people were doing wrong. I have changed a lot over the last years with that. But what I did really note is just how easily the women had babies, just so much more easily. They walk everywhere. They just had very little problems. Rarely did we need to call the OB. They just had their babies easily. And I worked in Haiti in like 2011, and at a birth center there, same thing. These women are walking a whole lot. They're walking a long ways to come to the birth center. Maybe they're riding a motorcycle, or riding in the back of a, I don't even remember what they call those, where there's just a whole bunch of people. They call it a bus, but it's like a truck with the seats in the back, so they're being jolted along, and they're coming there for their appointments and then coming when they're in labor, and they just have their babies so easily. And we don't have our babies with the same ease that these women in other countries often do. Countries we would call developing countries that don't have all the nice things that we have. Yes, they need more hospital access, like in Haiti, where they can get what they need if there is an emergency, but just they generally just have their babies easier. And then
oh,
go ahead.
I was just going to say, it sounds like they don't do as many like standard interventions then, or different ones.
They don't, other than like at that one first hospital with the enema, but no, they're hardly listening to heart tones. I mean, at the birth center in Haiti, it's the people there have been trained in the similar way that we have in the US as far as midwifery goes, listening to heart tones on a regular basis, that kind of thing.
IVs and things like that, or
only if necessary. If somebody was bleeding too much, or there was some issue that they needed, or they needed it because they're going to transport to the hospital. There in Haiti, if the woman goes into the hospital, if she doesn't have money, she has to stay there until her family comes up with money, and her family is going to have to feed her and take care of washing and laundry and stuff too. And that was the way at the birth center. The families, after the birth, someone was designated to do the woman's laundry that she had from her bedding and clothes and stuff. I was in Colombia, and I didn't, their home birth is illegal in Cali, where we were, and I think all of Colombia. There were a lot of people who had, due to drug cartels and mining issues, who have moved from the coast into these large cities and were very poor areas of town. And so there was still an understanding or a real belief that midwifery was they honored that position. They honored that role a lot, but they can't have their babies that way there. But they do still have the traditional midwives on the coast. So potentially, I have not followed through on it, but there was the opportunity to go with a videographer. He does a whole lot with, I'm not sure, multiple media things, but he does movies, and he wanted to go there and interview the midwives, and he invited me to come, and I think I would love to do something like that.
Yes, that would be incredible.
And when I was in Colombia, one of the things so we went around the room and we were introduced and to these, so I went with Gonzaga down there, and we went to help these 3 different groups who were community supporting groups within these communities of people who had basically immigrated from the coast in and who were living in pretty impoverished conditions as far as finances, jobs that they had, homes that they were living in, and that. And we went around and we were introduced, and because we had translators, I could watch their faces. And there were a lot of people who were like CEOs and all of these people who were being introduced, and they were great. But when they got to me and I introduced myself as a midwife, they lit up. They were like, oh, they were just so excited, and they brought me gifts during my time there. And I realized how the lack of honor of midwifery in the United States versus somewhere else in the world. You don't realize how much, even if you're working as a midwife, you take that lack of honor on yourself. And it was very humbling and really made my heart glad to have them. It just made me go, oh, okay, I get it. It's not the role of midwife is something that's kind of universal, global, but is seen in different ways in different places. And it touched my heart.
Yes, I'm so glad that you had that experience. I know you have been just I can't even express how grateful I am for you and your support, especially through the birth and death of my baby Hartley. You standing alongside me and being present and holding space and witnessing.
It's an honor to be there with you. Truly.
Well, it was an honor to have you there, be present, and know that I could do it, and to hold me after, and I will never forget. And that will always be with me. I will forever be grateful for you.
Thank you.
And I will, yes, I'm going to be telling Hartley's birth story in another episode. And so if you're wondering who I'm talking about, when I'm talking about Tammy, this wonderful, beautiful, motherly midwife that I had, you are it. Tammy is the midwife. And so I'll link it back to this episode as well.
Nice. I'll look forward to watching that.
Yeah. And I will include some notes in the episode notes, how to get a hold of Tammy's magical, amazing, specialty, unique blend teas and herbs. And yes, thank you so much for sharing your insight and wisdom and stories today. Is there anything else that is stirring your soul in this moment that you feel like you would like to share before we end?
I don't think so. I feel like I have said a lot. Just that I am grateful to be a woman, and I couldn't always say that in my early years, and I am, and it only grows. So I hope for all women listening that they feel encouraged, that they can just grow to love themselves and themselves as women more and more, just as the years go on.
Yes. Love, love, love.